Hi, I'm Dan Sweet, Director of Communications and Public Relations for Helicopter Association International. We're glad you joined us today. We have a really nice webinar. Anybody who's been in the industry for a long time knows that noise is something that helicopters produce. We will get started in just a minute or so. We want to make sure we get everybody time to join. In the meantime today, we have a handout for you. And the only way we can do the handout, unfortunately, is by web address. So I'm going to leave this web address up on the screen for a minute or so. Either write it down, take a picture with your phone, do a screen capture. But this is a PDF of some of the slides that Eric will be showing during his presentation, and he wanted to make sure that you could take them with you. So again, please take a minute to download this form, and you can either read along or download it after the fact. I will show this address several other times during the course of the webinar, and we will get started here shortly. Okay, for those of you who are just joining us, again, we are waiting for just a minute. Want to make sure that everybody has a chance to join, but in the meantime, there is a handout available for today's webinar. Please do a screen capture, get you the address with your phone, or just simply write it down, and then come back in. This is a PDF, the presentation that Eric will be sharing with us here in just a little while. And so we will get started in just a minute. Thank you for joining us.
I think I'm ready.
Okay, Eric, I see you're back online. If you can go ahead and mute your camera for just a minute, we'll go ahead and get started then. Okay, thanks again for joining us, everybody. Sorry, we did have some technical difficulties to get started with today. Do appreciate that you are able to join us today, excuse me, for HAI at Work webinars, Fly Neighborly Training with the latest Robinson R44 noise abatement guidance. Again, here is a screen, an address that has a handout for you. I will show this several more times during the course of the webinar, towards the end again. So if you didn't catch it this time, you will have another opportunity. Our speakers today, as always, we start with Jim Viola, the President and CEO of HAI. Our panelist today is Eric Jacobs. Eric is a member and past chair of the HAI Fly Neighborly and Environmental Working Group for HAI, and is an employee with Sikorsky, a Lockheed Martin company. We also have Greg Brown today. He'll be moderating the questions at different points during the presentation. And speaking of questions, if you'll see that's highlighted, this is an interactive webinar, and we have at least 3 or 4 question periods throughout this presentation. Eric really wants to make certain that you have a chance to get the information you need out of this presentation. So please don't wait till the end this time to ask your questions. Please ask the questions using the question module that's either at the bottom of your computer screen, possibly on the side of your computer screen, to ask the questions during the webinar. Please don't use the chat feature. We try to watch it, but we don't always catch all the questions in there. Please use the question module itself. As always, this webinar is being recorded. We understand there's a lot of people around the world who are interested in this topic and cannot attend today because of flight operations or other commitments. And so we will be sending the recording link out to this as soon as we possibly can, probably tomorrow, but it could be as late as on Monday before it gets to you. And one more time before we pass it over to Jim, here is the web address one last time. Again, do a screen capture, do a print screen, do a write it down. Just make sure you can get this document because it's going to have a lot of great information for you. And now I'd like to introduce Jim Viola, the president and CEO of HAI, to join us.
All right, well, thanks, Dan, and thanks everybody for joining us today. There's already been some exchanges I've seen in the chat about maybe just posting that link, Dan, in the chat or the question so people can just click on it. But anyway, we'll get started today. You know, I think, and of course, you probably assume, helicopters are awesome. I've been flying helicopters for more than 35 years. I love going where airplanes can't. However, one of the characteristics of a helicopter flight, the thing that really gets me to look up, you know, and try to identify what helicopter it is when I hear it, is the sound, or as some would call it, the noise. I expect that nearly every helicopter operator has had at least one noise complaint of some kind or another, and noise complaints are nothing to ignore. And if operators are unwilling to address this issue that we're going to talk about today, then the complaints increase. And if the complaints increase, then we have a third party, often a government agency, stepping in to try to find a solution. And we have some of those working today with the national parks. So too often, these third party solutions result in which may happen, are limiting flight operations. And for you out there who have a business operating helicopters, this is not a positive option. So consequently, HAI developed the Fly Neighborly program many years ago. The purpose of this program and the current Fly Neighborly working group is to offer techniques to pilots which will help reduce the noise impact on the community near them. The program also encourages helicopter operators to work directly with the folks who are not happy with the helicopter sounds, generating a sense of collaboration where both parties are supporting each other. This allows rotorcraft businesses the opportunity to continue operations while reducing impact of the noise on those neighbors. Reducing noise complaints, which means is less likely a government agency will attempt to create mandatory noise abatement regulations. Equally important to the Fly Neighborly is the concept that just one helicopter pilot can spoil the good work and efforts of many other operators. From the earliest day of flight instruction, each pilot must understand their actions can directly affect a business, an airport, or even an industry. So please don't be that pilot. You can still enjoy the flight. You can go places airplanes can't while limiting your impact on those around you. So today's webinar is the first in a series where the HAI Fly Neighborly Working Group will present aircraft-specific information on how to reduce your noise impact on your neighbors. And while each of these webinars might focus on a particular airframe, many of the techniques can be applied to other aircraft. Keep these tips in mind as you get ready to make your next flight. So let's get started and ask you to join me in welcoming Eric Jacobs to our webinar. As said earlier, he is an active member of the Fly Neighborly and Environmental Working Group and is the past chairman of that group. So Eric, please turn on your camera and let's get started.
There we go. I had some technical problems just as I got on 20 minutes ago, and hopefully they won't return when we get through this. Hopefully you're all seeing my screen now, which is, can you all see it?
Yes, we've got it, Eric. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. This was hello and welcome to this flight neighborly training module on noise abatement for R44 approach operations. This first module I'll go through is part one. It's really a two-part training session. The first part will provide some general information on noise abatement, how it's noise abatement guidance is developed for helicopters. And then the second part will get into R44 specific information. This training is supported by HAI, the FAA, DOT, Volpe Center, and NASA as well. So it gets a lot of support. Training objectives for this course include, we're going to go over a brief overview of fly neighborly, a basic understanding of helicopter approach noise, and then get into an understanding of both the generation and avoidance of blade-vortex interaction noise during approaches. This is all part one. This is the general information. We will follow it up with provide knowledge of approach noise abatement procedures that are specific to the R44 in this case. Let's start with the overview of Fly Neighborly program, just a couple slides, and what is Fly Neighborly. It was initiated by HAI in the early 1980s. It is a holistic approach to mitigating helicopter noise issues. It's not just noise abatement. There's a lot of work with community outreach and relations as well. And it's really trying to do the whole package. Addresses operational, geographical, meteorological, emotional, and political aspects that all come into play when you're dealing with Fly Neighborly. And it's incorporated into there's the iFly Quiet program initiated by the FAA, HAI, and BSF, FS, the Vertical Flight Society, more recently. What's in the Fly Neighborly toolkit? First is noise abatement flight procedures, and then the second major element is route planning. You know, what you're doing has a large impact on flying neighborly, and finally community relations and outreach as well. This is a summary of some of the Fly Neighborly Quiet resources that you can use. I'm not going to go through it. We're going to send this slide out to all participants, hopefully, and that's the link that Dan just mentioned that you can get to. One of the slides should be this one, which gives you an overview of all the resources that are there. So do anything more on that. Also, one of the resources is the HAA Fly Neighborly tips flyer shown on the left there. It has some general tips for affecting Fly Neighborly and noise abatement. Provided some, additional tips on the right-hand side as well. Again, this is part of that link that you can get to. Not going to go to it in detail, but I did want to cover a few elements that will come into play when we talk about approach noise operations. First, always minimize or avoid operating at constant airspeed below 50 knots. And you ever listen to a lot of operations at 40 knots, you'll know why. It's really the best, one of the best ways to avoid noise issues. Second, routing, and we'll get into it. Once you do the routing, it can be as effective as noise abatement procedures when you're trying to address specific community noise issues. And third, here's descending flight. Straight in flight is quieter than turning flight. So you can do it with straight in flight is better, but there will be times when there'll be turning will be necessary. And so kind of the general guidance is turning away from the advancing blade. And that's especially when decelerating the aircraft is quieter than turning into the advancing blade. And level turns are quieter than descending turns. So it's just some of the general guidance that in here that will be turn out to be applicable to approach noise operations specifically. Just a quick break. Do we have any questions at this point? I'm going to take that. Okay. So,
Eric, right now there's not one. One of the questions that came up is how do you deal with noise complaints that are maliciously generated that the caller just want to stir up trouble?
That's a long topic, and we'll try to address that near the end a little bit, if I can.
Okay.
So at this point, yeah, we'll move on to looking at basic understanding of helicopter noise, and particularly helicopter approach noise. Our key objectives here are, to do a quick overview of the primary helicopter source noises, and then get into an understanding of blade vortex interaction noise, or BVI noise, which is the primary source noise issue during approaches that we're always dealing with. Helicopters have multiple rotor source noise mechanisms with several different directivities from the aircraft. Important ones include thickness noise, which is generated in plane, in the main rotor plane, as well as high-speed impulsive noise, and that's also in plane. And I'm going to deal with these any further today. What we will deal with is blade vortex interaction noise. It's generated generally below the main rotor plane, both forward and sometimes after the aircraft. You'll get, and that's what we're dealing with during approaches. In general, also have loading and broadband noise, which are both out of plane noise sources, and those will come into play, particularly in some of the other flight conditions as well. Should point out that generally thickness noise and high-speed impulsive noise are important during flight, level flight conditions. The most common reduction is reducing speed. There's not a lot you can do about loading and broadband noise, other than there are some techniques when you get into takeoff and level flight as well that can help, but we're not going to get into the details on those today. Let's look a little bit closer at approach noise. It's typically dominated by BVI source noise, that blade vortex interaction effects. They said both forward and aft of the helicopter. Your airspeed and rate of descent determine both the presence and the intensity of those blade vortex interactions, and it often occurs at normal approach speeds and rates of descent, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult and for noise abatement, but also why we can change operations to avoid as well. So blade vortex interaction is created when a rotor blade passes through or close to a wake vortex generated by a preceding blade tip. The intensity is determined by the distance and the geometry of that vortex relative to the rotor blade during that interaction. And BVI noise can be very impulsive, and that's the wop name is often been applied to it, and it's very directional, and it can travel long distances, and it can be annoying to people on the ground, and the source of a lot of complaints. In order to get both advancing and retreating blade BVI, it's both forward and rear of the aircraft, and so we put this all together and look at how it's generated, and it's a function of flight condition. Approaches are one, probably the flight condition that's most amenable to noise abatement procedures and or routing, and it can be very effective for noise abatement. And so this little visualization of a rotor blade interacting with its own tip vortices. Hopefully it won't be too jumpy when you look at it. The forward and the rearward. So those are when interactions are occurring both, and that's simply what's going on for blade vortex interaction noise. Again, I'll pause and questions. I think there may be.
The one question that came in is, looking at this, what can you tell us about any comparisons that people are looking at between the helicopter and the eVTOL community that's coming on?
eVTOL will be very different noise characteristics. Some of this may transfer over to eVTOL aircraft, but eVTOL will have in general its own issues. Generally, the thought is that the eVTOL will have lower noise levels. The next thing is to eventually find out if you get lower number of noise complaints. But some of this is translatable, some is not. I hope that sufficient.
One other quick thought on this, Eric. Is there a difference in the noise level between a two-bladed rotor and, let's say, a four-bladed rotor helicopter?
There will always be some differences on how those designs factor in, and it affects what flight conditions, what descent rate and airspeed conditions you're encountering BVI noise. It can also affect blade loading issues during it, those interactions, and have an impact on levels as well. But yeah, there are differences. But with going from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 plus blades on noise characteristics, and particularly if and when blade vortex interaction noise is generated.
And one last one on this one. How much does the gross weight of the helicopter influence the BVI?
It in general tracks with gross weight that it will increase, but BVI is a little different from other flight conditions because it depends on that interaction between the blade and the vortex, and how how that occurs and how intense it is when it happens. So you get into some of the larger helicopters actually are better on BVI noise generation, and so it doesn't, overall noise levels may track a little bit, but it may not be as intense. So gross weight has some effect, but it's not necessarily monotonic with gross weight. A lot depends on those individual interactions and how intense they are.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let me forge ahead here. Oh, there we go. So now that we've looked a little bit at blade vortex interaction noise and how it's generated, we'll take a little bit further closer look at it more on an aircraft level, with both the generation and avoidance of BVI noise during approaches. and why BVI noise occurs during some approach conditions. We'll look at deceleration effects on BVI noise and generation, which are very important, and how noise abatement procedures are defined for avoiding BVI noise. As I said, BVI occurs during specific regions of airspeed and descent rate combinations that are typically helicopter model specific. This graphic is, and it goes, it's in the original Fly Neighborhood Guide, is sometimes referred to as a fried egg plot because of its shape, but it is the generic representation of what you're looking at for when you're going to hit BVI, or how it'll look when you're hitting BVI with an aircraft. So look at what happens with the aircraft when you're in shallow descent. When you look at the 80 knot condition, you get little to no BVI and level flight for shallow descent at 80 knots, and that's because the vortices are staying, the wake vortices are staying below the rotor, and you're not getting any interactions. When you get to a more moderate descent rate, you can get down into that peak BVI impulsive noise region. In that case, the aircraft pitch attitude and the geometry of the rotor relative to the wake start getting interactions between those tip vortices and rotor blades, and you start generating BVI noise because the wake is interacting with the rotor. You get to steeper descents, you get past that region, and now your wake, the tip vortices are convecting above the rotor blade, passing above the rotor blade, again at a higher pitch attitude and the aircraft. So that's the mechanism. If you go through it, airspeed sweep at constant rate of descent, say 500 feet per minute, you'll get similar effects of going in and out of interaction of the main rotor with the wake and the tip vortices. So I really want to point out that the location, extent of BVI noise region, in some cases may be regions for helicopter. They are helicopter model specific. You can't take the information developed for one model and apply it directly to another. Sometimes it'll be very similar, but would not recommend doing that. They take you in the wrong direction. So as I know, deceleration is an important aspect of in addressing approach noise. You can often use deceleration to reduce or avoid BVI noise. So deceleration increases aircraft pitch attitude. So aerodynamically, the rotor, even though you're at a given flight condition, say in the middle of this descent condition at 80 knots and 500 feet per minute descent rate, aerodynamically, it's as if you're at a higher descent rate, and that's why you're able to avoid BVI. So that gives you that steeper approach. So I'm going to try to play. You have to tell me, can you hear this? I don't think I hit.
No sound.
All right. I'm gonna have to back out for a moment and go put in sound.
You'll just need to stop sharing for just a second, Eric, and then start sharing again.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through that. I forgot to do that.
Technology is supposed to be our friends.
Let's try that. That's right there. Let's get back in and see if it works. Come on, give me a slideshow. There we go. So this is a constant, doing a constant descent in the high BVI region, and listen to it. I don't know how well you're able to hear that, but that sound recording has some fairly intense BVI before overhead forward BVI, and actually also has retreating blade BVI after the aircraft passes. So it's got a lot of BVI during the whole recording. Decelerating. Hopefully you're able to hear the difference there. Note that deceleration can also put a helicopter into its higher BVI region, in a shallow, low rate approaches. In that case, aerodynamically, it's as if you're going through that peak BVI region. So it's something to be aware of. It can be your friend or it can be your foe, depending on when you're under what conditions you're doing deceleration. So in this case, if you're a shallow rate or low descent rate approach and you need to decelerate, typically you need to do it slowly and accelerate as slowly as possible to stay out of BVI. Once past, the BVI avoid region, that area of significant BVI noise generation, deceleration is no longer a factor. You can decelerate it and change flight conditions needed to complete a landing. So when we get into defining noise abatement procedures, so we're at BVI noise avoid region, we have operational considerations, constraints, of course, safety, all factor into developing a noise abatement procedure. In this case, a descent below the BVI, say below in this plot, BVI avoid region is likely both operationally and acoustically effective. You can decelerate past that BVI avoid region at any time. It can be executed. Alternatively, this case should be able to decelerate in level flight to get below the BVI avoid region and then drop down into a descent condition before decelerating down to complete the landing. And as I said, because BVI conditions are specific to each helicopter model, approach noise abatement procedures will tend to be specific to each helicopter model. In this case, an aircraft that has a much larger BVI avoid region, that initial, drop down into a descent, in this case, 8,800 knots above 600 feet per minute. It's effective to decelerate a constant rate of descent, remains effective, may not if you do it at constant glide slope. You may get into some BVI. So these are all factors in terms of the BVI generation that come into play on defining noise abatement procedures. The other elements, the safety and operational considerations, we'll get into discussion when we talk about the R44 specifically. So just key takeaways from this whole section of the training here is that understand the airspeed, descent rate, and deceleration determine both the presence and intensity of BVI noise during approaches. Every helicopter model has a range of airspeed and descent rate combinations with significant BVI noise. So deceleration effects can help you avoid or put you into high BVI noise. Deceleration generally helps at higher descent rates, but may cause BVI at lower descent rates. And so approach noise abatement procedures use combinations of airspeed and descent rate plus deceleration to avoid BVI conditions. This is the end of our first part of our training today, the webinar today. Are there any questions?
Eric, no, right now, I think everyone is ready to go into the R44 portion of the presentation.
I'm sure that's what you've been waiting for. Okay, we'll go into part two. And we're going to spend some time talking about the Robinson R44. This is so our objectives are interpreting what is the R44 operational noise plot of BVI noise versus approach condition. And end up hopefully end up with knowledge of the recommendations for R44 approach noise abatement, and as well as knowledge of left, center, and right noise abatement characteristics for the R44. And finally, how all of this data is applied to defining approach routes, flight neighborly approach routes as well. And we will get into oral comparisons using some R44 recordings, and hopefully I'll have enough time to do quite a few of those. It was a 2017 NASA FAA will be flight test conducted for the R44. It was over a large microphone array in Florida, and all that data was used to generate an operational, it's called an operational noise plot for the R44. And consider this the latest Friday generation of Friday plot for the R44. In fact, besides there were a lot of objectives during this test, and they included over this large microphone a broad range of descent conditions, and we're looking to have some identification of potential approach noise abatement procedures, and there's also maneuvers turns testing as well. So part of this testing, we did a lot of on-site field observations of the noise characteristics of the aircraft, and then post-test, there was development of this operational noise plot, BVI noise characteristics, and I'll get later some subsequent development of left, center, right results as well, which I'll get into. So we take a look at this, the operational noise plot here. The red contours indicate the high BVI noise conditions. Orange to yellow contours increasing indicate little or no BVI noise content during the flight. All of this is a based on a BVI noise exposure metric for the aircraft. So it's trying to really closely look at BVI characteristics versus flight condition. Gray and white ovals indicate regions of high and peak BVI noise generation. sorry, I should say that they don't really cover the full extent of conditions where you can get same BVI noise generation. So if we look at the identifying the high BVI noise abatement descent conditions, our first goal is to figure out a BVI avoid region and how far those high BVI noise conditions extend for the R44. The red contour in this plot shows an approximate boundary of a BVI avoid region for the R44. It uses that operational noise data. It is extrapolated at the low air speeds with a little bit of conservatism there. This is certainly exactly what it looks like in that range. So this is our definition of where we do not want to fly to avoid BVI noise and high approach noise for the R44. The green box indicates the primary noise abatement guidance developed for the R44. It's above 60 knots and greater than 800 feet per minute descent rate. And these, during the test, both on-site observations, ground noise contours, this operational noise plot, all the data points to you're going to get the quietest conditions within this box. We first presented this, we got some feedback that there's operations that can't exceed 800 feet per minute. And so looking at the data, we came up with a second region of alternative descent rates and air speeds for the R44 below 800 feet per minute. And this is for air speeds above 85 knots to avoid that, the BVI avoid region. I'll get into it. It may not be quite as good as the recommended one, but you will get a lot of benefit in this region as well. So recommended R44 fly neighborly procedures, approach procedures. First, looking at the primary region conditions recommended for descent rates and airspeeds. We have a need to transition from cruise to a descent condition in that green box. Want to do that above 85 knots. It's not critical how you get there, but you want to stay above 85 knots to avoid that BVI during that transition. Once you're there, maintain airspeed and descent rate within the green box as long as practical. And it doesn't have to be a constant condition, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, but want to stay within that box as long as practical. And then decelerate as late and as quickly as practical and safe to complete the landing. And again, we'll get into some more details of that later. For the alternative procedure, again, it's a descent condition into the blue box, and maintain airspeed and descent rate within that blue box as long as practical. And finally, decelerate at a near constant descent rate as late and as quickly as practical to complete the landing. So in both those cases, those decelerations will, again, aerodynamically keep you out of as much as possible out of that BVI avoid region. So in all of these recommendations, and we'll go through it, generally, the faster or steeper an R44 approach is executed, the better the noise abatement. And that's within both regions, and anywhere really above 60 knots, that is pretty much true. There is noise abatement guidance provided in the R44 pilot's operating handbook and flight manual, and it aligns pretty well with the current recommendations. It the basic procedure is to reduce airspeed to 100 knots, and then initiate descent, increase rate of descent to at least 1,000 feet per minute, which is a little bit over a 6-degree glide slope, roughly a 6-degree glide slope for the in this case, and then reduce airspeed to below 65 knots using a fairly steep approach. Doesn't define fairly steep, drawing constant descent rate and constant glide slope. Cases here, you see, that the former keeps you within the green box, going a constant glide slope. You get closer to that BVI avoid range region, but it's still pretty good. So I don't really see any issues with the what's in the flight manual as well. Going to listen to just a set of recordings here. We'll go through all three. This is to look at a high BVI condition, the primary recommendation, and the alternative recommendation. Next, our primary descent within the primary recommendation. And finally, listening to our alternative condition. All of these recordings were obtained beneath the aircraft, slightly to the right of the flight track, and general near where you need here peak BVI conditions relative to the flight track. And I think they track fairly well with the recommendations, for primary and alternative, and what benefits you're going to get at those locations. So this is a slide I want to get into and spend quite a bit of time on, because this is taking these recommendations and seeing how they fit with flight operations, and particularly since we're recommending some steep descent rates, approach angles, it does bring in a lot of practicalities and safety considerations that we want to look at in trying to implement these recommendations. First, the pilot workload and passenger comfort with high descent and or decelerations both come into play, and that may put some limits on what you want to do in terms of noise abatement conditions. So second, there's steep descents. You want to avoid auto rotation. there was no intent of these recommendations to make auto rotation a normal flight condition. So it does put a limit on descent rate. White knuckle approaches are not what we're looking for. It's something that works pretty well. There's a lot of factors on that descent rate as well, in terms of winds, and particularly whether wind conditions, whether you have headwinds or tailwinds. Particularly tailwinds when you're doing steep approaches can cause some issues of needing to fight the aircraft to get it down. Particularly if you're starting your descent from a specified waypoint into the landing, into your landing, that can have a lot of impact. And I know of one case where the pilots had to fight it down for the airport specified noise abatement procedure. In some cases had to add a leg into the descent to just get the aircraft down to the airport. So, those are all factors in the limiting descent rate. Another thing you definitely want to avoid is vortex ring state. I look at it. As there's noted, Robinson helicopter has a safety notice SN-22. That a good rule to follow is to never allow your airspeed to be less than 30 knots until your rate of descent is less than 300 feet per minute. So when you're rapidly decelerating for the high rate of descent approaches, we're recommending the R44. This this can mean that you once you get down to 40 knots or 45, 40 knots, it may require some rapid reduction of significant reduction of descent rate to follow that rule. Get down under 300 feet per minute before you hit 30 knots. So that's another consideration of safety. A comfort consideration, usually put deceleration limits at no more than 2 to 2.5 knots per second. Once had test pilots described 3 knots per second as sporty to me, so that's where I put a limit on it. And a lot of that has to do with passenger comfort. And those operators that have exceeded that for some of their aircraft, but just kind of a general rule. And you will get significant benefits usually just on 2 to 2.5 knots per second. It does bring in some operational considerations, like when you're doing steep approaches, and one of those is your starting altitude, the minimum starting altitude, to just have enough time to decelerate the aircraft down to below 40 knots. So that's an important consideration. That say if you're coming in for whatever reason, a 500-foot altitude, cruise altitude, and go into a steep angle descent, you're going to have some difficulty, completing that deceleration before you're running out of altitude. So cruise altitude can play a role in limiting your descent rate, and it may limit you to the alternative descent rate and airspeed range for the R44, just so that you have that headroom to complete the deceleration and execute it safely. So in general, I'll get into some examples, but recommend be good to bleed off airspeed before really getting into your deceleration, complete the landing. So once you get into either of those ranges, instead of setting a constant condition, better to bleed off towards the lower end of the airspeed range for each of those regions. So I want to go through some specific examples, discuss some of these things. If you're dropping from going from cruise into the primary recommended region, and you're closer to 800 feet per minute, so once you get into that into the region, the intent is it's a good idea to bleed off airspeed and before seriously decelerating the aircraft. Once you do that, you can decelerate the aircraft, constant glide slope, as high as you may do constant rate of descent. Just recognizing that once you get below 40 knots, you may need, want to drastically reduce that rate of descent below 300 feet per minute. Because if you look at that, once you finish that deceleration, what is it that get below 40 knots, by the time you get down to 30 knots, looking to get below 300 feet per minute, and that's our goal, or it should be will have to be a goal as a final segment, I guess, of this procedure. Going to the steep, the high set rates within that green box, it's even more important to get that airspeed down. And then once you get down to the lower end of the airspeed range, is to do a constant glide slope deceleration, which gets you down to more reasonable descent rates before you want to try to get down below 300 feet per minute. Going to the alternative, flight condition as well. It doesn't matter how you get into that box, but again, I recommend you want to be on the lower end of it, and if you can be closer to 800 feet per minute. As I said, it's better to have higher airspeed for decelerating the aircraft. It's probably better to start at lower airspeed, lower end of the range, but it is better to be at the as high as in that descent rate as you can within that region. Noted that want to do that deceleration at constant descent rate, at least get below 60 knots. So, and then you have more leeway in whether you then start going to constant glide slope or continue at constant descent rate. But maintain, to stay out of that BVI region, avoid region. You really want to keep your deceleration at the constant descent rate out of the alternative range. So I'm going to pause. Any questions or comments on this section, on this slide, really importantly.
Hey, there's a couple, but the one I want to ask is, how does atmospheric conditions affect the operational noise pitch that you're showing?
Atmospheric conditions have some effect. So in general, try to do with these procedures is to build enough robustness into them that even if you're flying under different atmospheric conditions, you're still getting the benefit of the noise abatement and the BVI noise reduction. So it's the intent is not to say, oh, at this atmospheric condition, you'll be that these boxes change, the recommendations change on an hour. But to hopefully that let that finish. I'm over on my time. But that it will withstand changes in those conditions and still give you the benefits.
Okay, thanks.
It's 4 o'clock, 2 more of those. It's my chimes. All right. So as I mentioned, the next step with this data was doing left, center, right analyses of the data. We defined a 3 wedge geometry for left, right, left, center, right noise characteristics, center in the flight path into the landing location. So it's that red arrow, and set up a fixed width of that center wedge. For it's basically a plus. It's 45 degrees out from the aircraft in both directions, or down, however you want to look at it, for a 6-degree approach is the definition. We have looking at what we got, and these are, I'll show you the original operational noise plot, and then here are left, center, and right plots of taking the measured data and predicting BVI noise levels. As you see, the highest BVI noise occurs in the center wedge underneath the aircraft. What you would expect. It's significantly lower to the left and right, and it's lowest to the left. In all cases, it decreases with higher airspeed and decreases with increasing rate of ascent, particularly above 60 knots. So the general left, center, right findings we had, we summarize them. Avoid approaches over or near noise sensitive areas when possible. Keep noise areas to far left or right of the aircraft. And what constitutes far left or right will be somewhat site specific and noise issue specific. But and it's most effective to keep noise sensitive areas to the left side of the R44. I don't think I'm going to have time to go through a lot of these. What we did listen to before were in the center wedge. We list, these are the same recordings here. What I will go through is just, I think, listen to the BVI. This is and off to the right side. Sorry, started there. And finally, left side. as you can hear, hopefully you can hear there's substantial benefits keeping the aircraft to the left side, flying to the right of noise sensitive areas. So you keep noise sensitive areas to the left of the aircraft. It tracks whether you're doing the peak BVI flight condition or the other two sets of recordings here, one in the primary noise abatement recommendations, the other in the alternate recommendation. All of these track very well where it's highest in the center, better right, it's best left. Do we have time to go through this next section or part of it? I will continue ahead. So all this guidance helps in defining approach routes with the enhanced flight enabling outcomes. If you look at a current operation flying into a helipad, particularly over these, they can impact multiple residential areas, any of which can be noise sensitive. So and look at our left center right wedge on top of that. That gives you a look at what's going on there. So an alternative case, might be to fly in along that commercial roadway on the right-hand side of this figure and do a left-hand turn, which will be away from the advancing side of the main rotor, and then complete a descent into the helipad over the commercial buildings there. Alternatively, you come in left side, again, in that is commercial roadway, and do a right-hand turn into, in this case, a shallow turn into the to the right to descend into the helipad. May be workable. To me, this looks like a school on the plot here, so it may not be the best choice. But really just looking at potentials here. And then if you look at potentials, how you might modify them. So that, because there are a lot of routing considerations besides just noise. And so, for example, in this case, it may be better on that first alternate to turn earlier and come in, coming in over those commercial buildings, which might allow for a little more clearance into that helipad and a safer flight condition. So, I'm not saying that any of these are good or are usable alternatives. It may just be, but they may work, and they're worth looking at based on the knowledge of aircraft noise characteristics. So key takeaways from all this: there are recommended approach procedures that are effective in all directions from the aircraft. The best noise abatement, you want to be in the green box, operational noise plot, constrained to less than 800 feet per minute. You can use the blue box on the operational noise plot, sitting there. You want to decelerate as late and as quickly as practical and safe to complete the landing. If possible, avoid approaches over noise sensitive areas, keeping noise sensitive areas to the far left or right practical, and far left is most effective. And then when you're doing all this, keep in mind practicalities and safety considerations, particularly for executing steeper R44 noise abatement approaches. Safety always comes first. Put together a help sheet for the R44. This is available on the link that was provided at the beginning. On the right-hand side is approach noise. It's a little more cryptic, but it summarizes those key takeaways. On the left side is some general tips and a little bit of guidance for takeoffs and cruise, general guidance for takeoffs and cruise conditions. Any questions?
Eric, one of the ones that we have is there a big difference between the R44 and R22 in terms of PVI airspeed avoidance by noise abatement procedures?
You said the R22?
Yes, and R44.
I'm not sure. My guess is they may be similar, but don't have comparable data for the R22. We'll say that the comparable data for the R66, and the R66 is very similar to the R44, but I can't say for sure for the R22. At this point, the recommendation would be to try the R44 conditions and see how they work out. And that may include going out in the field and listening to the aircraft for your operation to see if you're getting similar benefits.
Okay. Next question talks about why has advanced blade slapping technology not progressed as quickly as it has?
That gets into a lot of issues, you know, and you know that the whole you know, vortex generation, trajectory of vortices, rotor, the interactions are very difficult to model and to know as well. There are some design features that help, and some that have been implemented or potentially be implemented to necessarily eliminate the problem, but are beneficial. So there has been some progress, but it's you know, it's a difficult road to go down and get there. And in reality, when you're talking about a lot of existing models like the R44, I think at this point it's pretty unlikely that there's going to be you know, an update, you know, of the rotor design or to incorporate any technology that might work. It's just usually not economically feasible on an existing design like that.
Okay. Another question came in is, you talked about bleeding off airspeed before deceleration. Are those one and the same or are they different things? Just to kind of get some clarification.
It's kind of, yeah, and point out, yeah, that talked about your cruise altitude going in. If you're low cruise altitude, as soon as you get into noise abatement descent condition, you really got to start decelerating. If you're from a higher altitude and you get into noise abatement condition, you have some leeway, and it's really just, you know, when I say bleed off, it's probably a slower deceleration rate, just trying to eventually target towards getting to the low end of the airspeed range. But yeah, they're both decelerations. The first is to prep your flight condition for